Welcome back to Quiz Blitz. Here we go with a new Would You Rather. Today you have to choose between real food versus candy. Good luck! Before starting, please subscribe to the Quiz Blitz channel for more exciting quizzes. First question. Would you rather fried egg or gummy fried egg? Would you rather burger or gummy burger? Delicious! Would you rather banana or candy banana? Would you rather pizza or gummy pizza? This choice is harder than I thought. Would you rather corn on the cob or candy corn? Would you rather Coca-Cola or gummy Coca-Cola? Would you rather a real bracelet or candy bracelets? Would you rather fries or candy fries? Would you rather lemonade or lemon heads? Tell me your choice in the comments. Would you rather get a ring or get a ring pop? Make your choice. Would you rather strawberries or strawberry candies? That's a tough choice. Would you rather goldfish or Swedish fish? Would you rather comment your favorite candies or eat real worms? Yum! Would you rather see a real UFO or eat a UFO candy? Would you rather save this kitty or unlimited Kit Kat? Not easy. Would you rather berries or candy berries? Do you have any ideas? Would you rather apples or candy apples? It's candy apples for me. Would you rather cherries or candy cherry? Would you rather giant crocodile or giant Coke? What's your choice? Would you rather black noodles or licorice? Would you rather peach or candy peach? Would you rather have a toothbrush or eat toothbrush candies? Would you rather have a lifesaver or eat lifesavers? Would you rather hot dogs or gummy hot dog? Would you rather hard-boiled eggs or chocolate eggs? Would you rather Smurfs or sour Smurfs? Would you rather sushi or sushi candies? Would you rather bouquet of flowers or candy bouquet? Would you rather watermelon or watermelon candies? What do you think? Would you rather strawberry cake or Airheads? Would you rather get Snickers or eat Snickers bar? Would you rather carrots or gummy carrot? Would you rather pancakes or fluffy pancakes? Would you rather oranges or orange candies? Would you rather get a real coin or get a chocolate coin? Would you rather brownie or chocolate lava cake? Would you rather gummy Coca-Cola or sour Coca-Cola? Would you rather croissants or chocolate croissants? It's chocolate croissants for me. Would you rather M&Ms or Smarties? Would you rather Crunch or Milka? Would you rather go to Mars or eat a Mars bar? Would you rather pineapple or pineapple candies? It's pineapple candies for me. Would you rather chocolate or candies? Would you rather salty popcorn or sweet popcorn? Would you rather chili or chili candies? Would you rather spaghetti or spaghetti candies? Would you rather noodles or noodle candies? Would you rather skewers or candy skewers? Would you rather gummy bears or marshmallow bears? Would you rather ice cream or ice cream candies? Would you rather swimming with sharks or shark candies? Would you rather cookies or macarons? Would you rather mango or mango candies? Would you rather coffee or tiramisu? Would you rather muffins or cupcakes? Would you rather coconut or Bounty bars? Would you rather strawberry or Twizzlers? Would you rather beans or jelly beans? Would you rather donuts or gummy donuts? Would you rather tamales or hot tamales? Choose wisely. Pick your next challenge and make sure to like and subscribe.